All right. Welcome, everyone, to our October 5th Housing Forum meeting for the Clark County Housing Option Study and Action Plan process. Thank you for your continued participation in these forums and comments and email comments. And just we appreciate all the thought that you're putting into this as we work on making recommendations to County Council. I will hand it over to Jose to kick us off.
Thanks, Steve. Let's go to the next slide and I just go over the agenda real quick. So good afternoon, welcome. It's good to see all of you. We're gonna just kind of go over, and Steve's gonna talk about the facilitation approach for this meeting, and then we're gonna provide an update on the project and the purpose of this meeting. And then we're going to get into the reviewing the outstanding policy issues that Elizabeth is going to cover, and then hopefully resolve any lingering questions that you might have or clarifications, and then move on to the next steps in the process. So next slide. Under the, can we get to the welcome and updates just for a second? I just wanted to note that Jack Haroon is here, replacing Brian Halbert, and he is also a Planning Commission member. And so I just wanted to introduce him to the rest of you if you don't know him already. And that, yeah, welcome. It's good to have you, Jack. Okay, so again, thanks for joining this extra edition bonus forum meeting number 5. As we were trying to sort of refine the draft code updates since we last met with this group on this topic in February, we've had continued refinements to the proposed code and started the code adoption process, had the open house with the public in March, presented to Deeb in May, before recommending the draft code at the end of May. We had Planning Commission recommending adoption of the code in June, followed by several work sessions with council and a lot of discussion about how the design standards and compact lots might affect development feasibility and the outcomes. Council held a works hearing on July 25th and directed staff to have to continue refining the proposed code with greater engagement with our stakeholders, and that's why we're having this meeting. So next slide. So again, the purpose of this meeting is to really refine the policy issues and provide clear direction to council for their decision-making, specifically on these topics of detached ADU height, compact lot development design standards, applicability of narrow driveway standards, the narrow lot parking standards, lot coverage, and like I said, trying to wrap up any other issues that you may have as we move this forward. So I'm gonna turn it, so that's the purpose of this meeting, why we're here. I'm gonna turn it over to Steve to briefly talk about the facilitation for this particular meeting, and then we'll move on.
Thanks, Jose. And it is a very brief commentary on the facilitation. So as you know, in our forums to date, the purpose has been to introduce these different concepts and just hear a wide variety of opinions and thoughts on each of the code concepts. And we've gotten through that process, and that's been really helpful. What we've been directed to do now is to, excuse me, focus in on some of these outstanding issues and try to come to some agreement on them as a group on what direction to go And so to that end, I will be a little more active in facilitating today. We'll see how it goes, but in an attempt to try to find areas of agreement on these different topics. But we only have 2 hours. So in the event that there is no agreement, we will take the different considerations that we hear from you all and share those with county council. So essentially we'll on some topics, we may have clear recommendations where we agree on the course of action that we'd like council to take. In other cases, we might disagree and we'll just say, some people felt this way, other people felt this way. County council, you make your decision with those common comments in mind. So just wanted to throw that out there so people didn't wonder why Steve was suddenly talking so much.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Jose. Thanks everyone for being here for this bonus meeting. Yeah, and I'll just echo both Steve and Jose's points that, we're trying to keep our focus relatively tight today on some of these issues. But we also know that, we want to make this code work. So we want to hear your specific feedback and really just be driving towards, what can we bring back to county council that can be supported and hopefully lead to more housing development. As a preface, right, we heard a lot, I just wanted to call this theme out before we got started. We heard a lot about affordability from council members or from the counselors, as well as in some of the follow-up questions. And as many of you know, right, but just to help us set the stage, right, middle housing is not necessarily going to be that low income affordable housing. The goal is that it's going to be less expensive, more affordable, sort of more workforce, and definitely help provide some more first-time homeownership opportunities when some of the more traditional opportunities are increasingly expensive. But we're well aware, I think all of us on this call, of the many things that go into the cost of housing. So, the national backdrop right now, the financing and the lending and I was just on a previous call and we were talking about, mortgage rates at 7% just mean very different affordability issues than we have been dealing with in the past 10 years or so. But to that end, we can't control those factors, but middle housing itself, the primary cost savings are going to be coming from those smaller dwellings and the smaller lots. So the individual details, some of these code pieces that we're talking about are absolutely going to matter at the margins, but just trying to keep the focus on, what does affordability mean? How does one detail relate to affordability? It might be a piece of it, but there are also broader questions about long-term value, long-term community livability and viability that also need to be balanced against these affordability issues. So, so we've already had a few conversations and we'll turn back to multifamily housing, but really just remember there's a phase 2 where we're going to be talking about greater affordability and additional housing variety. So while we're on middle housing, yes, of course, every detail matters, but some details matter more than others. So with that, wanted to, again, stay focused on these initial policy questions. Just to give you a sense of why we picked these ones, these were the topics that were of greatest interest and underlined a lot of the questions that we specifically requested from the counselors in order to guide this conversation. So this is our preliminary list of the active policy issues where council has directed us to get more feedback from this group and to come back with a revised recommendation as necessary or an agreement on the initial recommendation. So that's why we're starting with these. We do have some more time for further issues that have not been considered, haven't been raised to date, that we would like to hear from you all. But this is where we thought we'd start. And also just to Steve's point about, whether we can reach agreement on some of these things, there are really just some policy preferences and differences that underlie some of these policy issues. So there isn't necessarily a technically correct answer to any of these. But that's why we're here. We're hoping to get some, agreement if we can, or just really important considerations, pros or cons. I've sketched some out in the memo, but you all have a variety of perspectives and experience beyond what I know. So let's get started. So detached ADU heights. This has come up a lot. There's significant changes to the ADU code to meet some new state requirements, and also that we had developed through the forum series. But a specific question was about the detached ADU height. Right now they can be up to 25 feet. There had not been any discussion, throughout the forum in the open house about increasing that. Any ADUs that are attached to a structure can go up to the same height as the main structure, but we've gotten some questions now that with the increase in the allowed square footage of these ADUs, is that there might be some interest to increase the height of a detached ADU up to 35 feet so that it can be the same as a primary structure. So that's one option. We can retain the existing 25-foot recommendation that's been the existing policy or the existing code, or increase that to 35 feet. So we're looking for some feedback on that. Did a little investigating out in the wilds, so to speak. And certainly the idea of putting an ADU over a garage can make a lot of sense. Because, not just Clark County, but nearly every jurisdiction I've worked in has limited ADU heights to 25 feet. It's really hard to find a 3-story building example. I really only found these 2-story examples, but in sort of poking around some more online, shall we say, thank you, Google, I came across, this idea of a 2 stories over a garage, and also was just sort of struck by, this doesn't look that different from some of the compact lots that and the compact dwellings we're talking about. And so could that, essentially that same physical form be put on a lot and call it an ADU? I don't see any particular reason why we can't have 2 living stories over a garage. That just hasn't been the model for ADUs to date. So if there is an interest in this, I would love to hear the group feedback.
Elizabeth, Phil asked if there are any reasons to not go to 35 feet as an option.
Sure. So the reasons not to really have to do with sort of, first of all, this idea that these are accessory dwellings. And so they've long been pitched as they are accessory and smaller in scale in terms of footprint and height than the main structure. And so they're just, meant to have a dependent relationship, shall we say. And that really has set neighborhood expectations around allowing ADUs to date. And so the concerns could be that allowing a 30 up to 35-foot tall structure where somebody previously had a garage could really have a large impact on neighbors. If all of a sudden they have 2 additional stories looking down into their backyard. So those are some of the considerations. But we're opening up a lot of other things with these code updates. You could build a duplex that's 35 feet tall up to the same property line. There's no reduced setbacks for these 35-foot tall structures, whether they're ADUs or secondary or, additional middle housing dwellings. So I think there's an argument to be made that while 35 feet would be more impactful than an existing garage, it's not more impactful than what is otherwise going to be permitted through the code.
Eric, did you have something?
No, I would agree with that. I think the main time you're going to see something over 25 feet to that 35 is when they're building it over an existing garage. And you have an existing garage, and then you need to get the living space above it. And I could see situations where it would go to a little higher than 25 feet. And it might not go to 35, but if it's allowed in the zone, I don't know why we'd restrict it. Like Elizabeth just said, other products will be able to meet that same setback. So it's consistent with the maximum height for the zone. If the zone's less, then we should go less. But that's my opinion.
Jose?
So do you envision like going over an existing garage? Are you envisioning going 2 stories above, or you just need beyond 25 feet to get the second story?
Honestly, just trying to keep things flexible. I don't know how it's going to be applied. And I think giving the most options up front and not limiting it, just you never know what the market's going to do. And if that becomes something that you see, I could see that you may need to go, 2 stories, maybe a loft in one area. If you have, like, say, living quarters, and then one section maybe where it's a little bit taller for a bedroom. I don't know. I'm not sure what we're going to see in the future. This is kind of a new market. So just trying to limit the limitations up front and give the most flexibility.
I think over a garage, you could probably make the argument that if you have a high ceiling in the garage, 10, 12 feet, so you can have a 10-foot door and have a truck with a canopy in it, park in there, then especially if you're fairly wide, by the time you get your 612 pitch on the top, you won't be at 35 feet, but you could probably get pretty close to like 28 or 30 feet.
Okay.
So you'd
Brian,
be
thanks, Daniel. Brian?
I don't know if my role in this housing forum is just for questions about the permitting, but I'm going to offer my opinion anyway, because I can't help myself. So the way we measure height, I just want to point out for the group, the way we measure height is to the midpoint of the highest architectural roof plane. So when you look at these, if you're not already aware, the height isn't measured to the peak, right? It'd be that midpoint of the roof down there. So I just did a little calculation. And if you did hold a 25-foot height limit and you wanted to go a 25% variance, it would get you to 31 1/4. And again, that would be measured to the middle. But I think that's with a variance, and provided that you're not making something unlivable, I think variances could be approved with extenuating circumstances that would warrant it. That's just my opinion.
Thanks, Brian. No, that's appreciated. Phil?
Yeah, I agree with Eric. I think going the height limitation in the underlying zoning district makes the most sense. If there's going to be any limitations, I think if it's a garage under design, we should certainly allow the accessory dwelling to go up to the height of the underlying zoning district. More flexibility is better. While these have always traditionally been called accessory dwelling units, I think these are now middle housing. I think under Washington law, I'd have to reread the definition, but that's my recollection. And so while we're calling them accessory dwelling units, they're really dwelling units. And I don't necessarily agree with the fact that they need to be accessory to the main use. It's just another form of middle housing.
Thanks, Phil. Jack? Oh, you're on mute.
For now?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I agree as far as the builder isn't going to go to the maximum height just because. It's going to be because it works with the design, because of the market. I think just making it permitted outright versus doing a variance is really the preferable. So we can just move forward instead of having to argue a case every time we go, want to do something. It just makes it a lot cleaner. I agree very much with Phil as far as like we're going like the new laws are to create density. When you look at historically what's happened in cities, you have to go more vertical to when you're shrinking the footprint, building lots and everything else. So I very much agree with that. I would like to add, though, that I think we need to go up to 37 feet across the board in these zones. And the reason for that is our new energy codes are requiring pretty much that we're having to run our ductwork through open web floor joists. We have some pretty onerous stuff coming down that we're trying to comply with. And all of that affects your building height, because when you have to go to a high heel truss, increase the floor spans. So I think I would also argue for adding going from 35 to 37 feet across the board, wherever our zone is. If it's 25, go to 27, because we need the ability, because otherwise we have to shrink our ceilings from like a 9-foot to an 8-foot ceiling. And as you get narrower and smaller, actually height in the ceiling makes a big difference from a livability standpoint. So those are my comments for consideration.
Thanks, Jack. We're going to go to Brian Snodgrass, and then I'd be interested to hear from Jose or Brian Matson on Jack's last comment. Go ahead, Brian.
I agree with everything that's been said. I think letting it go to 35 is makes all the sense in the world. I think, there's a presumption in these kind of discussions, and we do it in the city all the time, that the limit is 35 and most houses are 35, when of course they're not in the city, and even less so, I think, in the county. So if ADUs are built at 25 feet, they're going to be taller than a lot of existing single family homes that are out there anyway. I think also the raft of state laws is a game changer on sort of the context. And obviously one of those, HB 1110, doesn't apply to the VUGA now, but whenever any of that's annexed, it will. And so I think things are very different now. No objections either necessarily on 37. It sounds like a big political lift. I'd just be wary of that. But if there's a reason to, I'm not, that can make sense too.
Thanks, Brian. So it sounds like there's some consensus from our forum members on the 35. I just wanted to give Jose or Brian a chance to comment, either reflect on that or what Jack said about the 37-foot height. So Jose, do you have any thoughts?
So is that current building standards, or is that something that's coming down?
Jack, I think that's for you about the energy.
So the current stuff has been delayed a couple months, and there's been some issues there, but even under the current standards, when we're trying to get our energy codes, but definitely under the stuff that's coming down in the next, I would say 90 or 120 days, it's just been delayed a little bit, and I don't know when it's fully coming in. But in order for us to because we're really trying to push to like a net zero housing. Right. And so it's changing how we're actually constructing, because we can no longer, they're pretty much eliminating the ability to run ductwork below in the crawl space or above in the attic space for the most part. There's some deep buried stuff, but then there's the high heel trusses that add significant. And if they go to, in some of the energy options that we need to meet those codes, you're going from an R49 to like an R60 or different things. It just starts to really affect, the squeeze there. So yeah, that's why. So it actually is going to be pretty significant in our design. And again, we're not adding height just to add height if we can, but we have to comply, but also produce something that is as livable and, appealing as possible. So
maybe we, there's agreement on 35, and maybe Jose, it looks like Phil said March of 2024. So that gives you and your team a little time to look into those requirements coming down the pipeline there. Eric?
Yeah, just to kind of feed off of Jack's comment, I don't disagree with him, but I think changing the height in all of the zones now is maybe outside of the scope of this project. But can I suggest that instead of even say 35 feet, we just limit it to the height of the underlying zone, the building height of the underlying zone. So we're not limiting it with additional recommendations. So then when the energy code rolls out and it gets changed in that code, it automatically gets updated in this one, and it's one less thing to change.
That's actually a really smart idea. Thank you.
Sounds reasonable. Okay, thumbs up from everybody. All right, Elizabeth, I think we're ready to keep moving here.
All right, great. Glad we had a good one to start with. All right, well, that means we get to tee up this what may be a lengthier conversation about the compact lot development design standards, right? And I just want to say up front, I know that there are different opinions, and I respect a variety of opinions. I think we're all trying to get more housing, more different variety. So glad to hear all the opinions. Let's also see how much we can get to sort of a policy recommendation that we could all live with here on this. So just, as you all know, we're exploring this new compact lot development option. So these are lots that are up to twice as many homes on lots about half the size. This is not a development type that's currently permitted in any of these low density R1 zones. So therefore there are no design standards or any other standards for them, and also relevant to sort of residential development elsewhere in R1 zones. There are no design standards that apply to any other single family detached homes. So that's a feature of the current county code, and no changes are proposed to that. But with this policy proposal to add compact lot developments, make these smaller lots and smaller homes at greater densities, a component of those proposed regulations to sort of balance that increased scale and maintain livability and sort of the neighborhood feel. There are 3 sort of design standards, right? That there's a main entrance facing the street or, connecting to the street. The garage width is limited to 50% of the front facade width, and that driveway impacts are managed. So it isn't just, a whole street full of double car garages and no sidewalks in between. And there are several options for how those driveways can be managed, either with a narrow 10-foot driveway, shared driveways between adjacent residences, maintaining 20 feet spacing between driveways of any width, if that fits with the lot widths, or adding alleys. And, we certainly understand that alleys are not always the right design solution. That's why this is a menu of options as written. But we know there's been a lot of discussion about this, a lot of great thought about how this could actually get applied. So, if we're going to add this to the code, kind of similar to your point earlier, Jack, that we're not adding height just to add height. We're not adding code just to add words. We want to add it so that there's a purpose, so these can get built. So we're looking at a way to, reconsider this package of standards for the compact lot development to try to achieve these various aims. Either retaining the proposed design standards, removing the proposed design standards, or modifying those proposed design standards. So a couple of things that we've heard so far or have thought of, heard some interest to decrease the minimum side yards. And so that could just, create a little bit of extra room on the lot, a little bit wider, and make it a little less difficult to try to fit these widths. Another idea I've heard or have seen in other jurisdictions, thinking about, sorry, let me say this right, to calculate the width of the garage or the area of the garage based on the total front facade area rather than just the width. That gives a little bit more flexibility. I've also heard a recommendation to just limit garages to a maximum width period of 9 or 10 feet. And so I have a couple pictures on that, but also just to clarify in this discussion, there's been a lot of interest about how these smaller homes, like we saw in this previous slide, that are 3-bedroom, 2-bath with 2-car garage and a double wide driveway, that still is a desirable product. And so just to say that those could continue to be built in medium density zones, possibly in these new compact lots if they were 42 feet wide. And then we're also decreasing the minimum lot size in the R15 zone to 4,000 with these proposed code updates. So maybe that's another opportunity. So just as a reminder, these compact lots are not the only place where these new homes could be built, but hopefully they're an important part of our housing. So just to help illustrate, some of the differences when we're talking about how we might address, these compact lot sizes and fit a livable, desirable home onto, which is obviously open to interpretation, what that means, but fit some homes onto some smaller lots. So one thing that really stood out to me is that our standards are about measuring, the proposed standard is about the width of the garage relative to the width of the home. And I think on this single story, more classic, shall we say, Snout House example on the right, that really is going to make a big difference. The width of this garage relative to the house, it really makes it the dominating feature. But when you look on the left and you have this example of more of a 2-story design, the width of that garage has less of an overall impact on the house because there's so much else going on, right, at the house. So, if we measured sort of the area of the garage as a percentage of the total front plane of the house, there's enough else happening in terms of windows and connection to street and livability and those kinds of questions that we have been talking about, that it's possible we could meet this variety of goals with some different design solutions. So curious to hear what you all think about modifying these. Yeah, I don't know if you want me to pause on these pictures or go back to the slide with some options, but
go ahead, Phil.
I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I guess just one point I want to make that I think isn't part of the public policy discussion, but I think it's important, is that we're talking here about building much smaller homes on smaller lots in an attempt to make them attainable for working families. While I don't disagree with the philosophy behind trying to have more attractive fronts with the front door up there, I do find it a little disturbing, essentially, that what we're saying is that if you want a 2-car garage, you've got to be, upper middle class. If you can only afford a starter home, then you only get a 1-car garage. We're just not going to allow folks who can only afford starter homes to have 2-car garages. They can only have 1-car garage. Granted, you could do a tandem, but to me, that's a part of the policy discussion that just hasn't been out there. Now, I like the house, the picture we're looking at, I like the house on the left. I think it looks a lot nicer. If it were up to me, that's probably what we would build. But it's not lost on me that essentially we're regulating by, income level, the number of garage spaces people can have. And I don't feel very good about that.
Thanks, Phil. Others? Jack?
Yeah, I agree with Phil. I mean, or certainly, I very much agree with what Phil's concern is there. I kind of have a concern when we talk about garage width and kind of design standards. Is I think what we build matters, and I think it matters for the long term. I think it really does affect the community, and I drove through a lot of communities with the snout nose, design, and then the same as. So on the one hand, we could build Stalingrad and be the most efficient and most affordable as possible, but I think it does matter what we produce. And I just talked to one of my subcontractors yesterday. He's doing a subdivision of 111 houses. He's starting next week or something like that. And they're basically all for a hedge fund. They'll all be a rental. They're all single family, all for a rental product. And what happens in those scenarios is it becomes a very much same as product. So I think I like the idea if we're kind of being more creative about creating the opportunity for a 2-car garage, but not having it the dominant feature. So when we look at the picture on the left, I'm like, okay, I can get behind that. I think one of my solutions is, I think in the city of Vancouver, and Phil or Brian could speak to this. I want to say you couldn't do a repeat of the same house over and over in a subdivision. You got like every other house or every fourth, you needed, a few different housing options. I could get definitely behind something like that, and eliminate the same as option. And then I like the more than 50%, the picture on the left and what that produces. Especially if we can figure out how to get a 2-car garage scenario in that. So,
okay,
that makes sense.
We'll go Eric and then Ron.
Yeah, I think my preference would be to eliminate the design standards altogether. But what you're looking at with the 50% of the facade, not the width, is definitely better, and is probably more consistent with, I guess, the goal. The width doesn't make much sense at all. I mean, look at the examples in the draft code. they're not to scale. So when you look at, and I think it's mainly over the main entrance orientation options, but the width of it's completely off of scale. But there's other pieces to it besides just the front facade, and I don't know if we're getting to that later, like the location of the front door, and then also the driveway widths, because I think that example on the left doesn't meet the front door, but it's still a nice looking product. That front door looks further than 8 foot back, and I think this is a great example of what should be built. So just a few other pieces, but I think there's always unintended consequences of putting these design standards in place, and they're usually good intentions, but they most of the time there's unintended consequences, and there's sometimes better ways to handle it. So that's kind of my position on it.
Yeah, and can I just say quickly, yes, Eric, all this, I just used this slide to illustrate the width issue, but yes, let's talk about all three of these. So appreciate your thoughts on that.
All right, Ron.
Yeah, thanks. A couple of things that I think we really need to continue to be focused on is this is specifically compact lot development. And you're going to get as much affordable amenity, I think, as a person can design into the lot. But what Eric said, I think, is valid for this particular instance is let's do away with the design standards, or let's move towards the idea of shrinking the side yard setback requirements to broaden these narrow circumstances out as much as possible, giving the builder as much flexibility within the lot as possible. To me, the example on the left is it's a single car garage, but it's also a single car garage because that's all the room there was in the lot. If they had an opportunity to have figured out how to get a 2-car garage in there, they probably would have done it. And so just moving back to the aspect of, I don't think this is affordability based on who gets 1 or 2-car garages. I think this is really, we're talking about these unusual lot sizes and what are we going to be able to do towards creating density and affordability in that kind of marketplace. So the amenity of a 2-car garage, I think that's great. And I think if it's designed in as part of the house feature, then that should not be mandated or denied by the design standards. But if we also give us as much flexibility in the lot as possible, I think we will get as much as possible out of the design.
Thanks, Ron. Brian?
This is a good discussion. It is a hard issue. I think Ron raises a good point that we shouldn't lose sight of, that these are the compact lots. It leaves many other options for developers in other zoning situations if they want to do bigger garages. I think it's also important not to lose sight of that there is a whole host of, there's tons of existing housing in the VUGA. So folks who who want a 2-car garage and don't have a ton of money still have some of those options there. This is just for a particular niche of the zoning code. And I think the garage issue isn't just aesthetic. It is that, but I think it's also has to do with the street front experience, and particularly parking, on-street parking, I think. And that's not to say we shouldn't look, maybe there's some ways of having a more flexible standard here. The issue of more flexible side yards, that's worth exploring. But I think the broader principle of having, in this particular niche part of the zoning code, of having some sort of restriction on the garages, I think makes sense, and not just aesthetically.
Elizabeth, any reflections on what we've heard so far? Any nexus that you're seeing in terms of a direction we might take this in? Because I'm hearing some differing opinions, and I'm not finding that kind of flexibility. I think I heard as an area of agreement, but not necessarily specifically what to do with the design standards.
Yeah, I mean, I think there have been a lot of good points raised. I think that I'm hearing, no objections to decreasing the side yard setbacks. So that seems like some easy flexibility that we can add. I could certainly see us moving to a more flexible front facade standard. Again, like measuring it differently. I'm happy to take another look. That width, is a simple. We're trying to keep it straightforward, easy to measure. But that doesn't have to be the only way to do it. So happy to look at a more flexible way to do that. And then I think from there, it might really just be, it might be about summarizing these various points and conveying them to council to help them inform their policy discussion. Because I think a lot of really good insights here. But Jack, do you want to bring it all together for us?
No pressure.
Right. Okay. So I would say, yes, on reducing the side yard setbacks. I think that could be pretty, agreeable. The driveway spacing, we didn't really talk about that, but especially when you're developing on, I'm sure Eric could talk more to this, but when you're developing on a sloped lot, it really affects how the driveway placement actually can functionally be. Mm-hmm. So I would eliminate the driveway spacing requirement, because the driveway kind of needs to go where the slope and ground dictate.
And if I could just clarify real quick on that, there is no one requirement. Not every lot needs to meet this 20-foot spacing. A measure needs to be taken to manage driveway impacts. And so if the 20-foot spacing isn't desired, it could be the 10-foot driveway. It could be sharing a driveway with the neighbor. It could be getting that 20-foot spacing, but only one of these options is required.
Gotcha. Okay. So I don't know. I've just, so I'm not, I would have to really dig a little bit more into all of that to really, but maybe Eric or somebody can mm-hmm. talk about how that develops the thing. I'm all for doing the 50% of the total facade and create some flexibility there. I think there's a little, maybe we can get away from like hard design standards. And then my personal thing, I don't know about the group, is just variability in design in the subdivision. So that would be my one personal thing of like, I think this would be a good add. And then remove, create as much flexibility as possible, but we just can't do the same thing 110 times. So, yeah.
Thanks, Jack. Eric?
Since Jeff mentioned the driveway standards, I did have a few things, and unintended consequences of almost all of the ways that are dictated to show it. One is, Jack brought up the having shared driveways, and if it's on a slope, you really need the driveways on the high side. Otherwise, they're too steep to drive. And you look at number one is provide off-street parking areas. That can work. It also adds cost, and it decreases affordability when we could accommodate it with other things. In the previous, when we looked at the narrow lot standards, instead of giving this much like kind of restriction, basically all it said was you have to have 2.5 stalls per house or something like that. That was more flexible than what we're showing here.
So we are going to talk about that as issue B, but yes.
Okay. But let me just kind of go on a few of each one. So option 2 is provide alleys meeting the standards. Now alleys, again, they add cost. The market's not always supportive of alleys. They build them because they have to, not because people actually want them. The general, I think, public that we see in our clients, they want to avoid alleys if possible. People really want a backyard for their pets, and alleys take away from it. And then we're always balancing competing interests and competing things. So the environmental community would be, we don't want alleys. That's way more impervious surface. You're double fronting. You have a lot more. You want green space and yards, not additional pavement. So the entire lot becomes pavement because you have a driveway in the back. You have a small front yard, which people don't use as much. But that space is better used in the back. And then let's see, we talk about provide shared driveways meeting the standards. So the shared driveways, I think the idea of that is to try to place them so you have bigger gaps on the street for on-street parking. But then other places in the code are basically saying you need to have narrow streets because of stormwater requirements and low impact development. So if your road's only 20 feet and you can't have, or even less, and you can't have parking on the street anyway, then putting these driveway restrictions in place and making them shared is irrelevant, really. You still don't gain any space on the street. So where you can gain it is by making your driveway widths a little bit wider, so you can park at least one car. And what we looked at on narrow lots is actually having the driveway shared, but having kind of a split stall in between, where it's kind of a guest parking between the two lots, and you're going with 2.5 car wide driveways, or even wider driveways, so it doesn't impact the neighboring developments. Narrow driveways, I think that's actually counterproductive. You want to have more parking on the lot if you can. And people say, yeah, I don't want to look down the street and just see a bunch of cars parked on driveways. But is it really much better if they're parked on the street than if they're parked on the driveways? The driveways at least put it out of sight distance. It makes it easy for emergency vehicles to get by. And it's usually safer, and you might be able to charge an electric car, which is also being mandated. So there's all these competing goals and interests. And I don't think we should restrict the driveways at all. I think we should basically allow us to try to be as creative as possible to meet a certain driveways or a parking standard that we need to meet the function and not impact the neighborhoods. So I don't love the driveway stuff at all in the code, and I think we should either rework it or get rid of it.
Thanks, Eric. Phil?
Thanks. So I think I agree with Eric's comments on the driveways. I'll elaborate on that in a minute. And I also agree with Jack in terms of, I think, using the entire facade makes sense if we're going to have any calculation on limiting garage width. One of the items I brought up in my email to the project team a couple of days ago, just commenting on here, is that we've been looking at we haven't built any yet, and you don't see many here in Clark County, but in other markets we've seen homes without garages at all that aren't alley load, and we're starting to explore that as a potential product to introduce to Vancouver, again, to help try to reduce cost, build smaller lots, smaller homes. If we have homes without garages, you can have a front porch, you can have a front door, but to make it work, you need to be able to park 2 cars on a pad in front of the house, which I think gets to Eric's point. Flexibility in how you manage that car storage helps. Is it better to have a house with no garage and 2 cars parked in front, or to have the garage dominate the first floor facade? I'm not sure, but I do know, I think I mentioned in my email, one of the projects we're working on, we're building a 15-foot wide home on a 21-foot wide lot at a small project in East Vancouver. We're cooperating with the Vancouver Housing Authority and Evergreen Habitat for Humanity and Proud Ground. Those homes are designed as single car garage on the front. It's a side entry. You have to walk back, 75% of the way back the side of the building. You go in the side entry into the main great room and kitchen. It's a very functional design. It works, but it's all garages out front. When we walked it with VHA, Proud Ground, and Evergreen Habitat for Humanity last Friday, there was discussion about, well, what if we didn't have the garage? What if instead we had, a front porch on one side? We took a portion of the garage, and maybe you had, off to the side of the porch, a door that went into a significant amount of storage. Everyone felt like the storage aspect was important, but maybe you didn't need to store your car in the garage. And then my last note is, again, I included this in my email. If anyone's been out to Evergreen Habitat for Humanity's Johnson Village project out in East Vancouver off 164th, that's what they're doing. They're kind of building a single level cottage structure. There's no garage, but they've got a 2-car parking pad in front of each one. If we're talking about attainably priced housing, it'd be nice to have that as an option. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Brian Snodgrass, I saw you were unmuted. Did you? No, nothing. Okay. Ron.
Yeah. Phil brought up a really good point. I think the idea of what you want to present back to the council is more along the line of the decision is around, do you want car storage off the street or on the street? It's almost irrelevant on whether it's inside a garage or not. If we're really trying to talk about the idea that these are more compact developments, the garage is a feature that adds cost to the whole project. And so I think that's a really bright way of looking at it, in the context of saying, you know, we're putting maybe too much emphasis. It's certainly a marketing tool for a particular product. People are going to want to see a garage. That's very traditional. But we should not make it where the design almost dictates that that must be the case to develop in this particular area. So I thought that was kind of enlightening to hear it put in those terms.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. It sounds like, Elizabeth, as you suggested, we might summarize the points that we heard in this discussion and forward those along to County Council, especially in the interest of time, as we're about halfway through our meeting.
Good reminder, Steve. All right. Well, I appreciate the variety of ideas. Yeah, and Ron, that's interesting framing. I think that might help us in our memo to council. And yeah, if we need any further clarification on some specifics, you know, what some of these options, like allowing a parking pad in front, what that might look like, we will get back in touch with all of you. Okay, so this issue C is more of a clarification, and it touches a bit on Eric's point earlier. So moving out of the compact lot realm, right, which is this newer, smaller option. I mean, smaller in terms of the scale of the individual projects. The narrow lot development standards have been in place for a long time. We're just proposing some clarifications to them as part of this project. And I think there has been, some of the questions have uncovered that there could be some confusion about how they apply. So where these narrow driveways apply, right now, the narrow lot standards apply to all R1 lots that are less than 40 feet wide. So these could be single family detached in some of the zones, like possibly in the R15 zone. It could be, and to townhouse lots, probably right now apply more in medium density zones, but right now these standards, they offer the flexibility to include, but most importantly, they do not require narrow lot developments to use alleys or shared driveways to minimize conflicts. So they add some standards, they make it an option, but it's not a requirement. And so with part of the proposed changes, the code adds a 10-foot narrow driveway option because elsewhere in the code, there is a 12-foot minimum width for driveways. And we felt like, well, if we're trying to offer flexibility in these narrow lot standards by using alleys and or shared driveways, let's add one more option and specifically exempt it from that 12-foot minimum width. So that is the proposal. I think there's been, because it's a little different, these are all optional for narrow lot developments. We're just creating flexibility within the rules. But, you know, as we just discussed and as maybe is revisited, right now the proposal is that one of the three is required for compact lot developments, but that doesn't mean they're required for narrow lot developments. However, in looking back at the code, it definitely seems like there's some opportunity to offer some more clarification in the code to make sure that it's clear that it's optional, and also to specifically call out where that 12-foot minimum is specified elsewhere in code to bring those standards into alignment so that it removes conflicts in future interpretation. So I think this one is, is a pretty straightforward clarification. Curious if any other feedback on this or questions about how this works or other clarification that might be needed.
Eric, go ahead.
I wonder if we're just doing it more complicated than we need to. If we're talking about narrow driveways, when I read through it the first time, I interpreted it a little different than the intent. And it kind of made it seem like you're almost required to do it or forced to do it if you didn't have alleys, or, if you're looking at the compact lots, and if you have narrow streets and you don't have other options to do some of the other things, that you're kind of stuck with these narrow lots instead of it just being an option. Where why not just decrease them to 10 feet across the board, or put it in the parking standards or driveway standards instead of have a whole other code section that's a little confusing. So I just wonder if we're just going about it a more complicated way than we need to. And if we get rid of those other pieces that we talked about on the driveway standards, this becomes a lot less relevant. And we could literally just change the driveway to not be 12 foot to be 10 foot. And you can always do larger. Very rarely are you going to want to go down to 10 feet, but it also then meets, some of the other standards you might have with stormwater and low impact development, where you might be able to do a narrow driveway, maybe like grass pave or something on the sides, so you can still park on it, and maybe it's not traditional, but you could do other things with it. So that's my comment. Just, it might not be necessary at all. I think there might be an easier way to get there.
Sure. Yeah, I get it. Right. Why create an exception to the standard? Why not just change the standard? That definitely sounds like something we can ask engineering about, if they'd be comfortable with that across the board. Yeah, if you have a 10,000 square foot lot or a 2,000 square foot lot, who cares? It could be a 10-foot driveway.
Bill?
Okay, thanks.
Just one thing to add. I agree with Eric. Some of the, I think, same issues apply to the narrow lots as with the compact lots in terms of how we store cars. From a practical developer's perspective, I don't really see a huge difference between the narrow lots and the compact lots. It'd be nice to see some continuity in standards.
Okay. Well, if there's no other comments there, then Elizabeth, I think we can keep moving.
Great. Okay. So similar realm here. We're talking about the narrow lot parking standards, which these would apply to both all the narrow lots, so anything less than 40 feet wide. So that's going to be all the townhouses, and narrow or single family detached also applies to the compact lots. So right now, narrow lots, there's not compact lots yet, but those are all required to provide 2.5 parking spaces per dwelling. And those can either be as off-street spaces, so garage or driveway. They can be on-street parking spaces if it's a local access street. You can't count anything on a collector or arterial, or they can be in an off-street common parking area. So there's flexibility about how it's provided, but the number is 2.5. The one thing you can't do is provide, say, 3 on one lot and 2 on the other and count that. Each individual lot has to meet the 2.5. So the proposal, what we heard in response to this, sort of slightly unusual 2.5 number, what we heard in response is that extra 0.5 is really trying to get at what some of you alluded to around when you have guests over and where are you supposed to park. So the party parking problem, as I like to call it, or the overflow into the neighborhoods, trying to create some additional options. And so, but we heard that although there's concerns around that, the existing standard maybe doesn't get at that issue very well, because people just fill their 2-car garage up with stuff, they park in their driveway, and then you still have a party parking problem where there's nowhere on street or elsewhere in the neighborhood to park. So the proposal was to change that standard and sort of separate out these 2 pieces to try to address these policy aims. So 2 spaces per home as off-street spaces. So that could be a 1-car garage and a 1-car driveway, or 2-car. You can always go over that. And then move towards a requirement for 1 shared space for every 3 homes. And that can be located on the street or in common parking areas. So that was trying to get at those issues. But we've heard a lot of feedback about, just trying to really understand what the issue is, where the flexibility can be, where the requirements need to be. So our options here are either to maintain the existing standard, to confirm the direction of the proposed standard, or develop some type of modifications to the proposed standard. And I'd love to get your feedback. I could not find a really good picture for a party parking problem, but, we all know homes, cars, driveways, streets. That's what we're trying to deal with. Eric.
I think either leaving it the way it is or also allowing on-site parking on the lot. If you do a two-car wide driveway, you can meet it. And that's a good way to meet it. The way it's written now, that doesn't even count as extra parking, and it is extra parking. And it gets very difficult if you have narrow streets as well, and you can't park on the street anyway. And if you're looking at eliminating a lot to provide off-street parking, that's sometimes very difficult to do. It's costly. It's not as effective as just allowing it in on the driveway in front of the house. And people do figure it out. I can tell you, like for party parking, people usually park right in front. I mean, you see that one with the little the exclamation point, but people do park behind the other car on their own driveway, and usually it's not an issue, but I don't think we count that. But the other, was it broken before? Are we trying to fix a problem that doesn't exist with these new standards? Because from what I've seen, these new standards the narrow lot was to address the issue, and I think it's working pretty well. So why change something that's not broken and create some unintended consequences somewhere else?
Ron?
Yeah, I guess I need just some clarification. So 2-car garage and enough pad in front of the garage for 2 cars. We're counting that as 2 cars or 4 cars?
That would count as 4 parking spaces.
Okay. And so the rule that says basically you can't get that bonus of the 4th car in that one household driveway because it's not the average, would say that houses that have 1-car garage and a spot for 1 car behind it, they're still a half a car short under this interpretation. Am I seeing that correctly?
So if under the current standard, if there were a home that had a 1-car garage and a 1-width driveway, yes, they would be half a car short. And so that half a car worth of parking would need to be either on street, like an on-street parking space measured along the curb frontage, or in an off-street parking area. But you couldn't count the extra space in your neighbor's 2-car garage. Okay.
Now that you've clarified that for me, I think I can offer the opinion that what Eric is saying is probably the way I would lean towards it as well. The existing standards seem to drive a reasonable solution. I would also say that if you were to have a mix of 1-car garage households and 2-car garage households, they should be able to average and resolve the issue in that fashion, because I do believe the streets are going to be narrow under all of these circumstances, and we can't really expect to get as much parking out on the street as has traditionally been the case, or subdivisions of the past when people reflect on how many cars are out there. I don't think in the places we're trying to develop, narrow lots, compact subdivisions, we're going to get that option. So that's my 2 cents on that. Either go back to the old way or go ahead and use the household averaging and take advantage of the idea if you can get 2-car garages.
Thanks, Ron. Jack?
Yeah, I think my concern is like, there's one thing to look at it as like a new development of subdivision, but since I do infill development, I look at, well, what if I had a 6,000 square foot lot that I was trying to subdivide into 2, and then I'm doing 2 narrow lot designs. that 0.5 becomes a real problem. And so I would eliminate the 0.5 and just go down to 2, just to provide more flexibility. I mean, the market's going to demand, generally you got to provide parking. But then I look at what they're doing in Portland, where they're doing developments without any parking. And so, which I think is kind of the direction the state wants us to go. But at the very least, the 0.5 I kind of have more of a problem with, because it's like, how do you, like, it makes sense in a large aggregate subdivision. It really becomes problematic when you're trying to take advantage of some of the narrow lot options, or lopping off a few thousand square feet off of a 10,000 square foot lot and building. How do you start accounting for some of those things? So that's my comment there.
Brian?
Oh, I agree with Jack that I think going to 2 makes a lot more sense, and it's just really need to keep in mind it's a requirement, it's a minimum rather, and so the market, if a developer reads the market as wanting more, there's nothing in this that would prevent them from doing so. I think the party problem, as you phrased it, I think also highlights a difference in general terms on storing cars on driveways and garages and versus more on the street. Although obviously all these solutions involve both. The street allows for that much more flexibility. So I'd be in favor of lowering this requirement to 2.
And I see Phil agrees with that as well. Does anyone disagree with that? Eric, I see you nodding your head. I mean, we heard a lot of different comments, but maybe this is an area of agreement, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'm good with 2, and then going back to the old way of measuring them, so you can use anything that you have, like either on the street, on your driveway, in an offsite parking lot, more flexibility to provide more options.
Seeing some heads nod there as well, and thumbs up. Okay.
I feel like I had a follow-up to that, but
Lots
I like hearing agreement. So, okay, let's move forward. If I come back to what I was thinking of. All right, next piece is lot coverage standards. So you all were here. We all know we've talked about this an awful lot in terms of the proposal to adjust the lot coverages, but there were some specific questions from counselors that came up around this. And so, in the interest of shaping our group recommendation, I thought I'd come back to it. So existing standard, right? 50% lot coverage in all the R1 zones. There's also setbacks, minimum lot sizes. You deal with it all day long. And so it's sort of a whole package of proposals that are minimums, not, requirements. There's a recommendation in the code to reduce those minimum lot sizes that then asks some questions like, oh, well, if the lot size is smaller, do we need to increase the lot coverage so that we can still fit a similar footprint of a building? We had a lot of discussions, a lot of really good discussions about the trade-offs here in this group. And so what came out of that is the proposed code includes modest increases in lot coverage for R15 and R16 zones to try to keep those footprints really similar in terms of what would be permitted. And just in terms of being responsive to the council, we wanted to use this group to talk about, whether to confirm the proposed standards or develop some alternatives. Whether that's adjusting some of the proposed lot coverages or, even heard some comments and some questions about, could we just remove lot coverage as a standard and move towards just relying on setbacks and height to address the massing of buildings? So a lot of numbers on this slide, but just to recap sort of what we've discussed so far and what is in the specific proposal. That's been a culmination of our work, right? You can see all the changes here to the proposed lot coverage. These are the 2 that we really spent the most time talking about, is between the changes to the minimum lot size and these proposed changes to the lot coverage. The coverage footprint for R16 and R15 is very similar to what is currently permitted. So these increases here make up for the smaller lot sizes. The other key part, right, the yellow highlights these increases to lot coverage to allow for middle housing. And, you know, in all this discussion about lot coverage, I'm not sure if we've previously highlighted compact lots. So I just ran those numbers as well to look at what those coverage footprints look like. These are coverage footprints, not just building footprints, because it includes all impervious surface. But this is our chance to come back to this issue and see if there's some adjustments to this table that would be helpful, or an alternative regulatory approach.
Can I talk?
Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in favor of less regulation on lot coverage, particularly on the smaller lots, just because we do have setbacks. We have to fit all the utilities in. We've got landscaping requirements. There's so many other requirements that govern how these things work. I think one consideration to keep in mind is that the lot coverage can impact the product that you build. We at Ginn Group have a lot of interest in, again, building smaller homes, and in particular, smaller single-level homes, maybe a 2-bedroom with a small den type home for an older demographic that maybe it's downsizing. If we have these lot coverage standards, we're going to be more inclined to go up to 2 stories. Whereas if we've got a lower lot coverage and we can do a single-story home, it might provide some flexibility to put a different product type on the market. So that's one consideration.
Thanks, Phil. Eric?
I guess I kind of had the same comments. The setbacks and the lot coverage are really kind of redundant. So if we are going to put a percentage on there, I almost think we need to kind of go backwards, look at the smallest lot, put the setbacks on it, and see what that leaves. And if whatever that coverage is, that's the number we should use. And in that case, we don't really need it at all because it's really dictated by the setbacks still. All right.
Jack?
Yeah, I would agree with going the setbacks versus the lot percentage coverage. We're always bouncing right up against the lot coverage, and then it's also I had another question that's subject to interpretation of, like, do overhangs, are those considered impervious surface, and does that 2 foot around the perimeter affect the lot coverage, or is it just the foundation footprint? And so in different jurisdictions interpret that a little differently, and different plans examiners interpret that a little differently. So I would certainly want clarification there if it's the actual physical footprint or if the overhangs were included. But I would honestly just go right to the setback requirements, because we still need places for our infiltration systems and the landscaping requirements and the trees and stuff. So I would just give as much flexibility and do away with the percentage of coverage, especially when we look at trying to develop the duplexes, the ADUs, the triplexes, and the fourplexes. I mean, if we want those built, this is all about creating additional density. So yeah, I would concur with everyone else.
Thanks, Jack. We have a bunch of hands here. Let's go to Daniel next.
I would think that we'd actually want to keep the percentages in there, maybe bump them up by 5%, so that when we're developing them, we know the engineers that are doing it have a bullet that they can shoot to. They can have a target so that they can go through and say, okay, we have to design our infiltration systems to meet this kind of coverage. If we just have it open, then it's going to make it a little harder for the interpretation.
Okay. Brian Matson?
So if I heard Jack correctly, he was asking whether the overhangs count for lot coverage. They do not. So I just wanted to confirm that point.
Okay. Thanks, Brian. Brian?
No worries.
Snodgrass?
I don't have a huge strong feeling on this, or frankly, I think the knowledge base of most of the other folks here on some of these particulars. I would say, though, that just a question, I guess, of tree canopy issues and regulations in the VUGA. I don't know how that's actually handled. I probably should. in the city, we're actually now getting some pushback from our forestry commission about wanting to increase lot coverage or yeah, to require lower levels of lot coverage and on single family dwellings in the name of more trees. And so I just want to pose the question, before we charge too far ahead on this, of what are the implications there and how does that get handled in the VUGA? But I do see the logic that most folks are saying about relying on setbacks rather than the sort of the full lot coverage number.
Elizabeth, I think Daniel mentioned the lot coverage, but most talked about setbacks. Are you feeling a path forward here?
Yeah, I this is really useful feedback. And I definitely hear this sort of emerging interest. A couple points that I just thought I'd add to the conversation. Eric, to your point, like if we have to have a lot coverage, can we just use the setbacks to figure out what that is? And it's a little I've done those exercises. You wind up with a range, right? I'm sure you all know this better than me, because it just depends on your lot dimensions. Because if it's wider, then it's a different percentage because your front setback is more versus, if it's narrower than your side setback. So et cetera, et cetera. So there isn't a number. And I think that's why jurisdictions have traditionally used both setbacks and lot coverage, so that the setbacks make sure that the structures aren't too close to each other, but the lot coverage is also intended to sort of address the total mass of the building. And so, you have some flexibility about where you put it, but the setbacks aren't necessarily designed to be wall-to-wall coverage. And so it's certainly worth taking another look at those to say, like, are we actually comfortable with where the setbacks are if there were a structure to occupy setback to setback to setback to setback? Is that a coverage footprint that we're comfortable with? Or do we need to, think about the setbacks differently if that's what we're using the setbacks for? And then I guess the one other piece to point out too is that in our previous discussions on this as a stakeholder group, and of course we're all free to refine our opinions and continue iterating on this, but there was a lot of talk about how it was important to keep these lot coverage percentages and to try to have some limits on the scale of dwellings because we're trying to create less expensive homes. And obviously it's not necessarily the government's job to say, thou shalt only have X number of square feet, and this is the only way to make a more affordable home. But there have been some jurisdictions experimenting, specifically with this tiered lot coverage. Daniel, you were making this point about how important it is to have additional lot coverage for some of these middle housing types. And so the intention of this tiered structure where you get, a bonus of additional lot coverage for additional units is really meant to incentivize adding middle housing to lots instead of, just building the largest single family detached home that can fit on an individual lot. So again, we can iterate, but there was a lot of thought that went into this, and I'm not hearing a lot of interest in that part of it. So if we've sort of changed our focus as a group, that's fine. But I also want to respect the discussions and the work that we've had to date. So any thoughts there?
Ron, go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, Elizabeth, I recall a lot of that discussion beforehand. And I think we were much more focused on the very small lots, the R15, the R16, in that particular type of discussion. And once again, I think there was a fairly big focus about the idea of compact lots, the narrow lots, the ones that are going to potentially yield that middle class workforce type housing, but at the same time give the independence of a detached home. And to meet the requirements of getting into those lots, I think we were trying to propose that very small personal space backyards, sacrificed somewhat for the sake of getting a reasonably sized dwelling in there. So I think in the context of this, I think it does reflect a lot of what we did discuss before. The line you have in here about coverage footprints, if that's including any kind of garage or impervious surface in that realm, I think that is going to be something that's going to give some people pause on the idea of how limiting that number of square feet might end up being in the whole aspect of trying to design around that. So trying, I think, to take today's discussion about, everything seems to be around flexibility. And in that regard, I think it's the idea of let's still try and make these small, unusual lots still developable to the target of what we're hoping to get out of it.
Thanks, Ron. Phil?
Thanks. I'll be brief. My experience has been on a couple of PUDs we developed within the city of Vancouver. And this is basically taking specific house footprints, putting them on small lots. In a couple of PUDs, I had to go in and ask as part of the PUD approval for 61, 62%. I think these increases are great. My practical experience is that somewhere 62, 63, 64% provides a ton of flexibility. It doesn't really restrict, allows you to go to a single level home. And it's just a shame to have to go through a PUD process or have to ask for a variance if the standard is 55 and it's like, well, I want to build a single family home, I need 61%. How do I get there?
Thanks, Phil. Jack?
So quick question. So is the driveway considered part of the lot coverage in the county?
Brian, can you help clarify that one?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question again for me? I'm sorry.
Yeah, is the driveway considered part of the lot coverage in the county?
No, sir.
Okay. But so if we're not going to go to setbacks, I would definitely would like to see almost, probably an across the board increase of 5% on the proposed coverages. You're especially get 60%, the difference between like 61 or 60% and 62 or 3% really can make a big difference in what you're able to put there. I agree with Phil. I do infill development, and so as much flexibility there as possible is what even if the counselors wouldn't go with like a setback to setback kind of thing, I would definitely, if we could just bump this up a little bit more, I'd be more comfortable with it.
Elizabeth, it seems like we don't have a single recommendation, but maybe a couple key ideas that had some consensus to them. Is that what you're feeling as well?
Yeah, I'm hearing some real interest to take another look at, what would it mean to go to just setbacks? And, is that a feasible recommendation? And if that isn't, then is there, ways to further increase some of these proposals here? Maybe even simplify it so that it's, so there's not quite so many categories.
Okay.
So does that feel accurate to the group? Anything sort of missing?
Not seeing any angry fist icons. So Phil?
My only qualifier on that is I'm really anxious to see these standards go back to council. So if it's going to take a lot of study, let's just start here and revisit it next year.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, Phil, I would say that if we could go back to council with a number rather than saying we just want to get rid of lot coverage and just use setbacks, I think it would be easier to sell. I think it would be easier to explain an increase to the existing standard rather than a different regulatory approach. But, they might also have the appetite to remove an entire regulation with some explanation. But yeah, I don't know if they wanted a lot of detailed sort of analysis. That could take longer.
70% for attached, and somewhere between 60 and 65 for detached if you're looking for individual categories. I think that probably works in most cases.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that feedback. It's good to know sort of how things look when you start actually laying them out. All right, well, that brings us to sort of, we've got about 30 minutes left, and can have some, open discussion. I think that we've been really focused, and I've appreciated the feedback at this point. We're not trying to completely open up the drawing board again, because, Phil, that was an excellent point. We are trying to get back to council. We are trying to help them, get to a decision point. We want to respect the work that's been done. There's already been planning commission work. So certainly, like, the more narrow these refinements are, the easier it would be to go straight back to council rather than having additional process before we get back to council. But with that in mind, we are taking this additional step. We do want to craft, a recommendation to council that there can be broad support for, and that, that council, that we can hear some support when we get to the council hearing. So if there's something that is keeping you up late at night, this is the chance to share it with us and to workshop it with this group to see if there's any other high priority changes you would like to see in these limited revisions.
Jack, go ahead.
Okay, I have a few things that I think. A simple one: allow for detached multifamily in the code. And so if we wanted to build, a duplex but have two separate structures, or a fourplex, I think it's simple, doesn't affect anything. You're still meeting all the other stuff, but thought there. Remove
just
the type.
Real quick. So detached middle housing, I know it's technically classified as multifamily now, but it won't. But you're not talking about detached 12-unit apartment projects.
Well, you could. I mean, if or let's say this, if I had
it's not part of, we're not, just to say we're not doing multifamily, but 4 units or less, we could definitely have that conversation.
Correct. Yeah. So if you're doing a fourplex and you wanted to do like 4 small houses on a lot, and then under the fourplex code, then just allow that, so you can create an option for the marketplace to do that, or, I would remove the type 1 review for triplexes and fourplexes. It doesn't make a lot of sense to have a duplex, but not for the triplex and fourplex. And I'd also include the triplex and the quads in the R1 20 and the R10. So those would be my three things.
Thanks, Jack. Eric.
Yeah, are we talking about all the stuff in this batch?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So
everything in the draft code, if it's going to keep you up at night, let us know.
So going back to kind of the deed memo, a lot of them are covered, and some of them, to tell you the truth, were misunderstandings, and I think we cleared them up. But kind of looking back at where some of those recommendations were, we did not touch on cottage housing. And one that I think is a big deal, because we have clients that are not building, is that garage limitation. We did fix it in the ADU code, and it has a different definition of gross floor area maximum. We should have that same definition and be consistent in the cottage code that basically subtracts out those items that are in the cottage code. So that's one of them. That's, I think, a pretty big one. And let's see, the triplex and quadplex standards. Mm-hmm. Some of those have the same kind of design standards that were in the narrow lot, or not narrow lot, the compact lot code. So again, whatever we do there, let's do the same thing here and make it consistent. And then there's a recommendation on the Highway 99 standards, and it's just one of those like outliers that whatever we do here should also be allowed in the Highway 99 standards. And we should make sure that those don't restrict the same type of housing that we have here, because that's a great spot for it. And there's no reason why it should be restricted in the Highway 99 zone. So that really was, I think, the only other like code things or some policy decisions on other pieces to help make it affordable, but it's not necessarily code related. So, but yep. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. I just wanted to say one point about that Highway 99 piece. We have flagged it just for technical reasons, the way that those standards are like this one giant PDF in code. And anyways, point is we're going to package all the changes to the Highway 99 plan for both middle housing and for the multifamily and move it forward in phase 2. So thanks for helping keep that on the agenda. That is coming. It is not part of this package just for these technical reasons about the way the code's structured.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Daniel.
I had some stuff around the cottages. I believe that there is a proposal to drop the garage from the standard. And if we do that, I think that there probably needs to be a maximum garage size placed in the cottages to make sure we don't have 3-car garages put into cottages. There was probably some code clarification in the cottage. In one place, it says that if you have an open space, your cottage main entrance has to go towards the open space. But there's a little further down that says if you're within 20 feet of a street, then you have you have to have an entrance from the street, but it doesn't say main entrance. So I think that if you narrowly interpret it, you could argue that you have to have a main entrance on the open space plus an entrance off the street. So I think the intent there was to make it to where if you're within 20 feet, your main entrance could be the street.
Okay.
Eric already brought up the Highway 99 overlay. But there's also a Mill Creek overlay in there. And within the Mill Creek overlay, it says that the minimum size lot in the R110, R120 zone, even if you're doing a plan unit development or compact development, is the minimum size lot's 9,000 square feet. So R110 now is going to go to 8,000 square feet. So that probably needs to be looked at and modified. That's it.
All right. Thank you. Brian.
Oh, sorry. The other Brian.
Sorry.
Just a couple things on cottages. I would caution about going too far on allowing the garages. We tried to strike a compromise in our code. It seems to be working. One problem that we're in the process of fixing in our cottage code is that there are some cases where cottages front an active street where you'd want to be able to have you want to be able to essentially have the house face the street. And so having an option whereby the cottages can face the street, provided they also have, view and access and so on to the common open area, I think, might make some sense. Lastly, I don't know if it's in the purview of the code work so much, but I was struck by the memo for this meeting that noted that for the new state housing requirements under HB 1110, an estimate that 2/3 of that's going to need to be met by multifamily housing. And so again, it's not necessarily code work, but it's a huge policy issue. There's going to need to be rezones to make that happen. Otherwise, it's simply mathematically, I think, impossible. And I think part of the concern is that doing all of this good work that we are for middle housing, I think can create the impression that is going to be sufficient to meet those new requirements. And I don't think that's at all mathematically possible.
Great.
And I think rezones have already been recommended by the earlier the consideration of rezones by the original advisory group. And I think there was also deep testimony regarding the need for R12 and R18 land. So I don't want to lose that as these narrower policy proposals, good ones though that they are, brought forward.
Thank you, Brian. Great point for us to remember. Ron.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point, Elizabeth. The packet that got put out has a significant discussion about affordability issues. you started today's discussion with affordability issues. I think you are significantly downplaying the opportunity to get some workforce housing, something in the middle tier out of the work that we're doing. I think it's pretty clear you are giving the building industry almost everything that they're asking for in regard to flexibility and hoping for an outcome. If this doesn't have any effect towards the idea of affordability, then we're going to be pointing it back to the aspect of the market and how much there is needed in there. Therefore, pricing is going to be sensitive based on supply and demand. But I believe that this group over a period of time has done a lot of work towards trying to give the flexibility to hold the cost of development down in that regard. So I don't think I would downplay that to the extent that you've chosen to do that. I think the amount of work that we've done, that you have kind of pushed the group through, reflects them having every opportunity to come up with items that would help drive down the cost of affordability. And I think what you heard from Phil earlier in the discussion, and Daniel as well, is like sometimes the product is just lesser. It's less square feet. It isn't 2-car garage. It's things that help create the opportunity to get the price down. So I think there's been a lot of work that's been done. I agree that it's limited somewhat still based on inventory. But there's been very few things that I think have been forced to remain that haven't been open for discussion.
Great, thanks, Ron. And Eric.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Ron just said. This is definitely a step in the right direction. And, you know, one kind of catchphrase is that it's been around the industry is you can't build affordable housing if you can't build affordably. And there's significant headwinds besides just this. This helps a lot, but you know, we have things like supply shortage, increased permitting cost, impact fees, stringent building codes. All of these, even modestly, combine to increase the cost of a new home. And there's also an economy of scale. So a lot of these are a base, no matter what size you build. When you add up all of those fees and costs and shortages, you kind of have this base. And what we found from our clients is building these smaller homes, they don't have enough of a margin to even make it worthwhile because they can't absorb all of the fees that are basically the same no matter what size home you do. So if you add all the impact fees up, just one example, it is a larger percentage of the total construction cost on a $400,000 home than they are on a $1 million home. You kind of spread that out over a larger cost. So those are some of the other things that are outside of what we're doing today, but are worth noting. And those are maybe some of the other things that will help in the future make housing more affordable. Like maybe there is a step in impact fees or some of these other fees that are necessary to build a home where they're more proportional to the size of the home and the cost of the home, not just a per lot basis. So.
Thank you, Eric. All right. Elizabeth.
Well, I can make Jose do this, but I'll do it. I'll just be the broken record to say thank you for your comments about the cottage garages, and we continue to get direction from the council that they would like to see that issue as part of the biannual code updates. So that is, Eric, that is the latest that I have heard.
Okay, and we're getting the exact opposite.
Oh,
so we bumped them from the biannuals on purpose. They did not go through. The biannuals are already done. They did not get put on there because they said they needed to be done comprehensively through the housing options plan. So I think now's the time to do it. We should include it now. And if it's not included now, then why would we adopt a code without something little like that, or something, an item like that, where it has to go back to the biannuals? They basically said it wasn't part of the biannuals. It got bumped and needed to either go through this process or a different process altogether. So it got shelved. So I say we do it now.
Jose, do you have any thoughts on that?
April will be discussing it with Deeb this afternoon and as part of the biannuals.
Okay.
Okay, let us know how that conversation goes.
I would say regardless, we put it in both, so they're consistent. But if the biannuals would be in advance, but yeah, we can talk about it at Deeb too.
If we hear something else, we will certainly align it. You know, we wouldn't propose conflicting code updates. So okay, I guess I did just yeah, I appreciate a lot of this feedback. I wanted to go back to a couple points, you know, since we opened it up, before moving any of these forward, right? I heard some interest in allowing detached plexes. That's something that we did consider as part of the process. Didn't hear a lot of support, but also didn't hear a lot of concern about that during the discussion, as I recall. And so is that something that as a broader group, you feel strongly enough about recommending the change with these refinements, that you'd like to hear that?
In my view, more flexibility is better. If the project can otherwise meet all of the standards, I don't see any reason to say that they have to be attached.
Okay.
Ron?
What's the minimum on cottage development? Is it 4 or is it 6 units?
4, I believe.
All right, so are we just proposing another kind of cottage development?
Small, right. There definitely gets to be some overlap. It's, you know, detached structures on a lot.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't know. It feels like we kind of got it covered, but maybe there's something about cottage development as a verse. If you're fourplex, you don't have to have a commons area.
That's true.
There's be cheaper ways to do the development. I don't know. I think for some people who have been working in the cottage development realm, they're going to be looking at this and going, "What? I could have done that? What?" That's all.
Okay. Jack.
Yeah, I would argue it for it just creates a lot of flexibility. It creates the opportunity if you wanted to condoize them, that it could work for, you know, multiple homeowners. It's just one more avenue, one more option, and you're still meeting all of the other requirements. So there's I can go on, but there's a lot of really technical good reasons just for opening it up, and it creates no additional impacts.
Okay, back to you, Elizabeth.
Maybe I'll say it this way. Would anyone have concerns if there was a proposal to allow detached plexes that went forward?
Go ahead, Brian.
No concern, I guess, just, you know, maybe a little more information. It sounds like it might work, but I want more information about how markets have responded to this where it's allowed elsewhere. I don't think it's too widespread, but maybe it is. So if there's examples of how this is working elsewhere, that would help.
Okay. Yeah, I guess then we also get to that question of, is this an important enough addition to the code package that it's worth taking that additional time, possibly additional review outside of this group if council wants to hear more?
Ron's got his hand raised.
Well, just knowing that Wolf Industries is working on several cottage development ideas right now, it feels like I would have probably proposed we just did unattached quadplexes and done a bunch of those, because there's just so much more. So cottage development has definitely more design standard to work with. And I just want to be sure if we're just talking about one quadplex on a lot that is unattached and the maximum is 4 units, or if we're just talking about, oh, we're going to call it 4 quadplexes, but they're not attached and they're really just 16 individual units. What does that mean? It feels like the idea could have a lot of merit, but it proposes a lot of questions to me that makes me think we would have probably put some of our programs on ice while we found out what this was going to be.
If I could jump in, so hearing you say that and thinking about that overlap, that's definitely something we've run into in other jurisdictions. This question of like, well, then what's a cottage and what's a quadplex? So one answer is, well, there's just more flexibility. So you can, choose your own adventure. But just thinking of the sort of how we would explain the rationale, thinking about this discussion we've had about the detached ADUs and how the ADU standards are loosening up, so that you can have a detached ADU, you can have 2 ADUs now under the proposed code. That's the direction from the state. So what would the group think about refining the recommendation that you could have a detached duplex or a triplex? So that would be 2 to 3 units. And then that would be consistent with what's being permitted for ADUs, but would not overlap with the cottages.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just to clarify, I've built this product before. I did it on 16th and Markle in downtown Vancouver. It was on a CX zone lot, and so I couldn't build a single family residence. So I built 3 individual 1,800 square foot houses. And then they're condoized. And so what that allows, the difference between that, because I'm a single lot developer, the difference between that and a cottage development, that's a whole subdivision process thing versus taking an existing lot and if you have the width and then dropping in basically 3 homes and then selling them individually. So reducing the cost. So the difference is, it's a single lot solution where you would never do a cottage housing on a 5,500 square foot lot, which is what my product was built on, because it would just never work. But so again, it's flexibility in the marketplace. It hits a niche market, but I think it provides, instead of 1 house, I had 3 houses built on the same square footage, and they were not apartments. And so when we look at workforce housing and trying to develop some of that stuff, it's just one more avenue. And so, yeah.
Phil, go ahead.
Just bringing up a practical aspect of these, detaching them, particularly if you want to do a condo plat, is helpful, just because the managing a condo association is a lot more complicated when you've got the shared wall, you've got shared exterior maintenance, shared roof maintenance. It's harder to insure, it's harder to manage. It just makes the housing more expensive, because oftentimes you need to have professional management layered over top of sort of the ownership. It's just a much more complicated picture. Detaching them helps with that.
All right. A couple other sort of recommendations that we've heard also have to do with these 3 and 4 plexes. So if we could use our remaining time to maybe talk about if there's any further refinements there. So I also heard some interest in removing the type 1 site plan review for 3 and 4 plexes. And the discussion that we've had on that to date, right, was the feedback we got from community development and development services that those projects, when you get to 3 and 4 units, can trigger frontage improvements, and we can debate whether or not they should, but that is currently the policy. And because of that, that community development and development services felt strongly that they needed a type 1 site plan review in order to address those issues rather than going straight to building permit. And so that's why the recommendation is what it is to date. Is there any further sort of insights or considerations that we should consider at this point to further refine that proposal?
Well, I mean, less processes is usually less costly. So
for sure, Eric.
It's one of those things that if it's
from
consistent with the neighboring development and you're looking at just building frontage improvements in front of this site and none exists anywhere else, it really shouldn't be required. Maybe sidewalk in front of it to get that, but just kind of consistency with the neighborhood. And maybe that's what's being reviewed at the type 1, but I'm happy that it's not a type 2. And it is just a type 1 process, and that is significantly easier than a type 2.
Right. Okay. Well, maybe that's one that we can move forward with the recommendation, but add an additional encouragement to community development to keep looking at ways to revise the frontage and therefore review requirements.
Isn't a type 1 basically just a building permit anyway?
Brian,
it's simple.
Yeah.
Yes. A building permit's a type 1.
Mm-hmm. So it's not a type 2 for even a quadplex or a triplex.
Correct.
The same as if you're doing one home.
But you have to run them sequentially, right? You got to do the type 1. Can you run them concurrent, Brian?
Run what concurrent?
Can you run your building permit and site plan review as one submittal?
I don't think that the permit center is currently allowing that because of the timeline that it puts on their building permits, and it makes it look bad as far as their turnaround. But there's no reason why it couldn't, other than that, in my opinion.
I was under the impression when you do, say, a single home, you're doing the site plan for the home and the home with one permit. It's all part of the type 1 process. So basically, if you did a triplex or a duplex triplex, it's the same process a single family home would go through on one lot because it's all on one lot. And it is a type 1 process, just like a building permit. That was my understanding of how the middle housing, permits were working for those multiplexes. It's basically the same process that it would go through for a single family home. They're concurrent. It's the site plan that goes along with the building permit as a type 1 process.
Right. When you say a type 1 site plan review, there's additional criteria that's thrown in there outside of a typical building permit. And that I think is what you were asking, Phil, is if that site plan review could be done concurrently with the building permit. Maybe that's not what you meant.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering if because I don't do a ton of that. It's problematic if they're sequential. If you can submit at the same time, even if they run on slightly different criteria, that was my question. Or do you have to get one before you can submit the next?
I think the idea is it's just handled like a normal building permit, like a single family home. It's the same type of deal. If you have to go through site plan review, there's a significant amount of cost and effort and different consultants you have to have and process. And you just added $50,000, $60,000 probably minimum to the site if you have to go through a site plan application for a type 2. If it's just a building building permit, like it is for a single family home, you eliminate all that. And I think that was the goal. So these multiplexes are handled just like a single family home on one lot. It's one structure. It's all done together. It's the same. That's how the city of Vancouver does it, I know, and that works pretty well.
Eric, this is Susan Ellinger. Yeah. So I think you're talking more like about a plot plan review as opposed to a type 1 site plan review. I mean, there's a difference between the type 1 site plan review and the type 2 site plan review. And at least the way it's written now, what's indicated, at least to me, is a type 1 site plan review.
Well, I think the goal then would be to handle them just like you do a single family home, because it's one structure and it's one building permit. Like the city of Vancouver does have a pretty good process for that. When you submit for them, if you're doing a multiplex or a duplex, it's handled just like a single family home, and you do it. It's the same process, and I think it goes up to a quadplex in the city. So I think the idea is to handle it like they do it.
Jack, go ahead. Then we're gonna need to.
Yeah, I would agree with Eric. I just want it handled just like the duplex, the fourplex handled just like the duplex, to that level, because it falls in line, I think, with the goals, and not created an additional multi-$1,000 process.
Okay. Elizabeth, you want to wrap things up for us? Any last words?
Well, I want to thank you all for a focused conversation. I think that we were able to really, provide some specific feedback to council, on some of the questions that they've raised. Next steps is really that we're going to continue the adoption process. I think that because there was some, a good deal of clarity that came out of this, that'll be helpful in revising some upcoming materials and presentations to council. I think that we will need to just talk with county staff and possibly county manager to just clarify if there's any additional steps we need before going back to council. But we will email you, let you know what those steps are. The ultimate goal, of course, is to get back to council for another hearing. They continued their hearing, but not to a time and date certain. So that just means that it still needs to be scheduled. And when we have that date and time, we will email all of you. And if there's any steps that are going to happen before that, we will also email you that. So thank you so much for being part of this discussion. Hopefully we will all see a lot more housing getting built soon. So thank you all for your role across the county. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone.